Okay, so we're going to start into what some historians refer to as the modern temper. One of the ways that I used to explain this to my high school students was that the 1920s are probably the first decade wherein I could transport a modern group of students and, have them absorb into the culture without too much of a shock. And so this chapter is a rather short one that delves into the sociocultural realities of the 1920s. So there are a number of periods in American history that are referred to as eras of good feelings. There was an official era of good feelings right after the War of 1812 and the administration of James Monroe. But after almost every decade after a major war victory, America experiences a kind of economic boom and sort of a heightened nationalism. But underneath the surface of this, there's, kind of problems. And we studied that in the last unit, if you guys remember, for the Gilded Age, was an era of good feelings, so to speak. And the 1920s is very similar to that. And so what we're focused on today is really just the sociocultural aspects of the 1920s and how it was the beginning of the modern era. And just to remind you that when we get into these chapters, in each of the modules on Canvas, you'll find these videos by one of the authors of this book. So, we get into this chapter and looking at this new sort of post-war economy, and it differed substantially from the one that preceded it. New products swept the markets, and as a result, prices dropped considerably. Things that had once been only obtainable by the wealthy were now purchased by middle class. And innovations in communications made a more homogeneous American society. We have radios and all these other things that come into play here. So what we get is a growing consumer culture. And this was something that really didn't exist too awful much. Exuberant consumption was considered, an exclusive thing of the wealthy and not a very respected behavior. And so with the end of the Great War, a lot of the initial slowdowns that came about because of the demobilization turned into a rather big boom of consumer demand because of people self-rationing during the war. So as you can see by this ad, we have modern advertising, but there's also modern marketing. And this is very heavily influenced by the works of Freud, believe it or not, the psychology and the idea of how people think about themselves and other people. And then, of course, this ad obviously shows all kinds of new gadgets by Westinghouse. And, it's kind of difficult to explain just how significant some of these were. Electric vacuum cleaners, electric irons, electric toasters, and, electric agitators, as they were called, what we now call a washing machine. These were just major, major gifts to society because it definitely freed up people from the drudgery of housework, and most specifically women in America. And so the one thing that was really different in this period is the idea of buying on credit. And again, consumption was not always considered a virtue in America, and so people lived within their means. And this stifles consumption. And the innovation that comes about here, what's today referred to as installment plans or layaway programs or what have you, are going to eventually become credit cards, which make their debut in the 1920s. And this is the idea of taking what would traditionally be a finite demand, because people only have so much cash on hand, and turn it into a potentially infinite demand by extending credit to people. And people definitely take advantage of this in the 1920s. So when it comes to major consumption, airplanes and automobiles are definitely the two biggies. Airplanes found their usefulness in the war. In the 1920s, they're going to be used kind of mostly for entertainment, but also for the delivery of mail service. The first airmail delivery will take place in the 1920s. And people begin to speculate about the commercial values of airplanes. And so airplane production starts to become a big deal. More significantly, from a mass culture perspective, is the automobile. And this is really reflective of the drop in cost. Henry Ford's innovation of the assembly line technique, which allowed the product to go to the people at each stage in order to add value to the product, was a major innovation that dropped the cost of each automobile significantly in the United States and around the world. Henry Ford once said, we mass produce them and people can have them whatever color they want as long as it's black. But the new technology that was out there really made for exciting products. And what we forget is, advertising is going to use the new marketing techniques of the period in order to entice people into getting what they think they want. And so we have this idea of entire new industries that come into play because both airplanes and automobiles, but specifically automobiles, require a whole network of support work to make the product viable. Gas station attendants and mechanics and body mechanics and paving the streets and all this other stuff. So there's a boom in jobs and pay in these major industries in order to make the products viable. So here we see radio and film. On the left here is obviously Charlie Chaplin, who was probably one of the most significant silent film performers of the era. And so on the right is one of the earliest models of radios. Radios proved to be very useful in World War I for information transference. And so what's going to happen in the 20s is the realization of a more commercial value for the time period. So in radio, information and entertainment become a big deal. A lot of vaudeville performers will transfer into radio content and make themselves very popular people. Just off the top of my head, the George Burns and Gracie Allen performances that used to go on vaudeville were transferred directly onto radio and then later into television. But what is perhaps one of the biggest innovations is that radio producers realized that females were their biggest market and started to perform melodramas in the afternoons. And laundry soap or laundry detergent companies, basically became the major advertisers or sponsors of these programs. And because they were so connected with soap, they became known as soap operas, which I think pretty much everybody knows what those are like. But anyhow, in sports, boxing is an incredibly popular sport. It's always been big in America. There's always been a lot of boxing. But this is going to be modern boxing where there's going to be more rules set up. It's not going to be the bare knuckle boxing that we saw in the 19th century. But baseball is hands down America's pastime. And the level of enthusiasm for baseball in this era is just going to be nothing short of obsessive. And riots are going to break out because more tickets were sold than there were seats, and just it gets really crazy. But baseball becomes quite a big craze. It's also the beginning of the popularity of college football, the NCAA getting organized in order to promote the amateur athlete. And then golf, which, believe it or not, had started to be popularized by President Taft, now starts to become a bigger sport, and especially with women. Babe Dickerson will become a golf whiz in the period, and women will find themselves involved, right? So in jazz music, modern jazz is a new kind of form of jazz. Jazz is an African-American innovation and creation. And it has evolved mostly out of minstrelsy and ragtime music. And so early performances, you will hear some of the ragtime motifs in it, and lyrics and similarities and things like that. But then Jelly Roll Morton is a piano player who is somewhat accredited for being the father of modern jazz, and he kind of moves the music away from ragtime and more towards what we would recognize as modern jazz. In New Orleans, it was Joe King Oliver who followed more of the Dixieland kind of jazz music, and he is credited for the discovery of Louis Armstrong, who becomes a very major figure in modern jazz. And what we see in the 20s is jazz is going to start to make a transition towards the end of the period, into the 1930s, when we start moving into what was originally called hot jazz, but is probably more widely known as swing music or big band. And the guy who's kind of the champion of this is going to be Duke Ellington. And what's interesting about Ellington is he brings in a much, I'm going to say, richer tone to the horn sections, but he really brings us into the big band era. He discovers Ella Fitzgerald and is credited for really starting a lot of people's careers, to be honest. And what's unique about jazz music is that it's the music of rebellion. And so the modern era really takes on a kind of rebellious spirit to it. And so there's this kind of idea that jazz music spoke to that generation. And so now what made jazz really significant on multiple levels here is that African Americans were not really allowed to perform for white audiences. So if you can recall, it's where we got blackface. In the minstrel shows, they were white musicians playing black music. And so they would do blackface. They would cover their faces in, basically it was burnt cork or shoe polish later. And it was basically meant to, condescend African Americans. Well, in the 1920s, in the speakeasy culture, because obviously in Prohibition, everybody's breaking the law for the most part, and it seems like all these other norms sort of fall away, and so these speakeasies will become venues for African American performers to actually play their music for white audiences for the most part for the first time. And this is, excuse me, a very controversial but wonderful thing that happens from the time period. For women, what we call the new morality, these were challenges to the Victorian mores that had developed in the late 19th century. And so a lot of it is influenced by Freud, the idea that human neuroses stems from repressed sexual feelings or incidences from childhood, and the idea that you need to be more sexually expressive in order to become a sort of a normal or a well-rounded person, or however you want to put it. And so with the women's vote and women's workers, we see really for the first time a collective increase in both status and agency for women. And it's we even get the Women's Party in 1923 to advocate for things like the Equal Rights Amendment and birth control. And so with the jazz age, right, speakeasy culture was allowing women to involve themselves in new dance crazes like the Lindy Hop and the Charleston and the Quick Step and all these other kind of fun things that people did. It's the early days of the jitterbug, for instance. But the rebellion music of jazz is now being opened up, and women are going to become big performers. I mentioned Ella Fitzgerald, but there was also Sarah Vaughan and Billie Holiday, and of course the great mother of the blues, Bessie Smith, who all become very successful people in the time period. Dancer Josephine Baker will become very popular, first in the United States, but then when her dances were considered a little too racy, she moved to Paris and became quite a big craze there. So the women of this era collectively referred to as flappers. There's a couple different references to it where it comes from, but this basically was for youthful women who cut their hair short, what was called a bob, and wore makeup in public. Max Factor was a stage makeup artist who decided to sell some of his products to the regular consumer audiences, and made himself a millionaire. But this is really the first era where women would wear makeup in public. And then, of course, drinking and smoking, which women really weren't supposed to do at all, but if they were, it was supposed to be done in private, is going to become a big deal. My grandmother was a flapper when she was in her teens and 20s, and she, always had to wear makeup whenever she went out, and just the idea that, she smoked until, not too long before her passing, and it was almost as if it was like a symbol of women's independence to be able to smoke in public. So for African Americans in the Jazz Age, this is also a period for increased status and agency, particularly for African Americans in the North. So the Great Migration was due, as you remember in the previous chapter, factory jobs had opened up in the North, particularly during the war period and the period right after. And the racism in the South just simply was not going away. It just was perpetuated. The 1920s, we'll see the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. And so, hundreds of thousands of African Americans are going to move north. And this leads to what's referred to as the Harlem Renaissance, which is really just an exemplary period where African Americans were able to create for them what they referred to as the new Negro. The painting that's here on the slide is from Aaron Douglas, exemplifies how black artists in the Renaissance used their African roots and collective history as artistic inspiration. And so we get this pride in black culture. Writers like Langston Hughes and, again, artists like Aaron Douglas are going to be out there articulating for African Americans a pride in one's own background. And this is going to be true in art and literature. It's going to be true in the civil rights movement that gets started here, what's called the Niagara Movement in the early 1900s, and has become the NAACP by the 1920s, begun by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Wells and others. This was an agency dedicated solely to increasing the status and agencies of African Americans in the United States. So one of the big issues that had remained, and Ida Wells was a very big campaigner to get this dealt with on a federal level. Lynching was epidemic in the South. And because of a series of Supreme Court cases in the 1800s, the understanding was that the civil rights laws that came about because of the 14th Amendment really only applied to the federal government. And so states did not necessarily two governments, period. And therefore, if somebody is lynched, it has to be tried as murder or attempted murder if the person survives. And this meant that a southern state was going to have to arrest a white man, put him on trial with a predominantly white jury, and get him convicted for assault, attempted murder. Well, that's just not going to happen in the South. And so Ida Wells and others will start to push for a federal anti-lynching law. And what happens is in 1913, a Jewish American is lynched in Georgia. which sparks the creation of the the Anti-Defamation League. And this Jewish organization has been now operating for more than 100 years for the purpose of stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and to promote equality and fair treatment of all Americans, regardless of their backgrounds. Similarly, the American Civil Liberties Union becomes active in this time period in order to promote freedoms for all Americans, regardless of who they are or their ability to pay. So Marcus Garvey, who's pictured here on this slide, is a Jamaican immigrant who believed in the idea of black separatism. Now, if you might recall that Booker T. Washington kind of suggested this in his movement in the Gilded Age, in that he believed that for the most part, white Americans were not necessarily going to accept black Americans as equals. And so he advocated for vibrant and progressive, prosperous African American communities with African American businesses and banks and churches and community organizations. And Garvey kind of takes that concept and militarizes it. And you see him here in a military uniform that he himself designed. And it was just this belief that, black men and women were not going to get a fair shake from white society. And so they needed to engage in what they called the Back to Africa movement. And so a lot of African Americans are going to advocate for reparations, but more importantly, the ability to move back to Africa and to rediscover their roots and to establish their own communities there. It's somewhat unusual because 100 years before, there was something called the American Colonization Society, and their whole idea was to repatriate, if you will, freed slaves to Africa, which is why we have the country of Liberia today. So it's odd that it's this advocacy. Garvey, by the way, is arrested for mail fraud and is deported back to Jamaica. So when we talk about modernism, right? So when Albert Einstein announced his theory of relativity, he upended 2 centuries worth of conventional wisdom. And this would lead to the birth of modern physics movement. And other scientific studies during the time would be transformative, right? And so, we have Planck and Einstein. We have in modern art and literature, right? The Armory show, which you'll see over here on the left, Max Weber piece, The Russian Ballet, the beginning of Cubism, if you will. And modern art and literature is basically breaking all the norms, and so you get these different sort of expressions that come out of the movement, and it's at the time considered unconventional. The Armory show was a New York art gallery presentation of a group of artists collectively known as the Ashcan School. And the popularity of this group of works in some ways launches modern art in America. But in literature, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and Gertrude Stein experimented with different forms of the novel and how to present literature, particularly when it came to things like dialogue. The Lost Generation, as Gertrude Stein named them, was a group of young writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, who were, in a sense, disillusioned with the end of World War I and the whole purpose of it and the world as it was forming itself in the time period. And so, whereas 19th century authors and artists had taken for granted that everything in the world could be readily observed and represented accurately, the 20th century counterparts here found themselves in a reality where new things could actually be created, and their works would reflect this sort of outlook. So the time period is somewhat on the verge of a new way of thinking. Now, what we have here is in chapter 23 is essentially an entire chapter devoted to the sort of new thinking, the modernist perspective. And I always caution people to be very careful because there's a tendency to, starting now, to have the authors kind of push a little bit on the narrative here. And so I have a theory about the 20s. And it's something that we see happening, I think, repeatedly in American history. And that is whenever the country and our society has dealt with cataclysmic realities. And in this case, I think it's important to remember that World War I was, for many Americans, an apocalyptic thing. It was death on a scale really unseen before, and in gruesome ways that were just unthinkable to many people. And then the famines and the diseases that happened during and right after the war just began to seem to a lot of people like the four horses of the apocalypse were riding through the world. And so my theory is that when societies as a whole, but particularly American societies, are confronted with these sorts of things, they either rebel or repent. And this chapter really is about the people who rebel. And this is the whole idea of, you know what? Live for today because tomorrow we die. Screw the rules. We're going to have a good time. Let's party and just, make good of life while we have it. But there's another movement which will be coming up in the next chapter. And it gets a little over-maligned, in my opinion, by the authors and by historians, period. But it's those people who chose to repent. People who felt that, we needed to go back to some of the old values. Now, the extremes on this front are going to be referred to as the fundamentalists. But there is also just a regular mainstream part of society that just wanted life to go, and calm down. What Warren Harding is going to call the return to normalcy, a word that he actually coins. And so the 1920s, or the Jazz Age, if you wish, were a radical change in American life and the beginning of modern thinking in America that really can be seen in so much of what we still do today, both on a social and cultural basis.